Wow, thank you so much for being here. I am so excited to be here this evening at Liberty Commons. Thank you, Doc Rob, and all the students and the parents and the educators that are here and people from the community. Thank you so much. So I just have a question for everyone here today. Has anybody ever had a bad day? Yeah, we all have, haven't we? We've all had times in our life where we think, along with the good, we've had some bad day. And I don't know about you, but have you ever had an experience where you think, gosh, I don't think I handled that very well. Maybe I took my frustration or my anger out on someone who didn't have anything to do with it. Anyone ever feel that way? Yeah, I think we all do too. And why is it important that we learn how to handle adversity? Why does it matter? It matters because your life matters, and your life matters, and your life matters. Everyone here, your life matters. And the way that you learn to respond when times are hard can have an impact on the rest of your life, and in ways that we often cannot even imagine right now. So I'm going to be sharing a story today of a gentleman who faced really hard times, harder than I hope that anyone here ever has to deal with. But we know that we all go through hard times in our lives, don't we? Sometimes it's more than just a bad day. Maybe we are dealing with somebody that we love or ourselves with a serious illness or an injury, or even the death of someone that we love and cherish. And we know how hard those times can be, those seasons in our life. As I said, I'm going to be sharing the story of Joe Rubinstein today. But before I do, I want to share a little bit about my grandmother. My grandmother was run over by a train. It sounds a little bit like a country western song, doesn't it? Unfortunately, but it is true. And the year was 1899. 1899 in the tiny little town of Green River, Wyoming. And sometimes we know that when bad things happen to us, it's through no fault of our own. Things happen that we can't control. And this was the case with my grandmother. She and her sister were walking across the main section of town. Of course, it was a little town back in 1899. And it was long before they had railroad crossings and flashing lights to keep us safe. But whenever the railroad would run a car down across the tracks in the middle of town, they were supposed to have a brakeman there to make sure that no pedestrians or horses or anyone was passing across. And this particular day, he was late for work. And in the little town of Green River, Wyoming, which is a railroad town, when they would release a railroad car, they wanted to couple it with the rest of the train. They would just roll this train car down the hill, and it would couple with another one, slam into another one. And again, whenever they did that, they were supposed to be somebody there. So on this particular morning, my grandmother and her sister were walking across, as they did every day, to and from school. But it was dark. They were probably giggling and laughing. They never heard anything. They never saw anything. And out of nowhere, that train car went bam and slammed into my grandmother and her sister. And it threw my grandmother underneath the train, and it knocked her sister out and away. Her sister, thankfully, revived enough to realize what was going on. She heard her sister screaming, who was being dragged down the train track, and she ran down and she pulled out my grandmother. And she saw that my grandmother's leg was crushed from here on down, absolutely crushed. It's the only reason that she lived in 1899, because there wasn't a drop of blood. It just closed, cauterized it, closed. She was 9 years old, and they had to amputate her leg. And as she was in the hospital for the next 2 or 3 days unconscious, her family agonized over what they were going to tell this poor little girl how she had lost her leg, that she had lost her leg. How do you tell a 9-year-old girl that she no longer has a leg? So when my grandmother woke up, they finally got the nerve up to tell her, and she said, "Oh, well, I'll just get a cork one." She had seen apparently wooden legs, and she thought they were made of cork. And so the remarkable thing was, though, for the rest of her life, that was her attitude. "Oh, well, I will deal with this. I don't like it. I don't agree with the fact that I'm 9 years old and I don't have a leg." But she found a way to go on and live an extraordinary life despite the fact of not having a leg. And I'm going to be sharing some slides off and on tonight, and I'm going to show you a few right here. And this was a picture of my grandmother. Can you all see? You're okay? Is this in the way? You're all right? Okay. This is my grandmother when she was probably 3 or 4 years old in the little teeny town of Green River, Wyoming. And this was probably several years before she lost her leg. My grandmother had to walk on crutches for 11 years because they were so poor they couldn't fit her with a wooden leg because she was growing, and they just couldn't afford to get one every year or so. So for 11 years she walked on crutches. She said she was so strong that she could arm wrestle anybody in the state and beat them, and I'm sure she could. And when she was in the hospital, a number of other really bad things happened to her. She developed a neurological disorder where she developed a very severe shaking problem. And so she, for over a year, just couldn't stop trembling. She also developed rheumatic fever while she was in the hospital, which then affected her heart and caused her to have a weakened heart for the rest of her life. And yet she persevered. And she was 21 years old before she was finally able to get a wooden leg. And I can still remember my grandmother having to have this heavy, heavy leg with these heavy, heavy straps that would just dig into her shoulders. But she didn't complain. And she graduated when she was the only one in her family that ended up getting an education, because they didn't think because she didn't have a leg that she wouldn't be able to have a family. And so she was the only one in her family that got an education. And they had to move to Nebraska because of the altitude, because of the medical issues that she was having. So she graduated in 1907. The valedictorian and the commencement speaker was my grandmother, and Carrie Smith. And if you can believe this, the class motto that year, "By our efforts, we shall rise." And I'm sure she had a hand in that. And her dad said, "You know, no one's going to marry that girl." And it wasn't because he was being cruel. He just thought, you know, in those days when you're that disfigured, he was so worried. It was more from a loving place. And that's why he wanted her to get an education. But she turned into this beautiful young woman. And then my grandfather there on the left had different ideas, and he did marry, of course, my grandmother. Unfortunately, he was a coal miner, had to be working in a coal mine from the age of 12. So my dad and his brother, my dad is there on the left with my grandmother in the middle. When my dad was only 9 months old, his dad died from black lung, working in a coal mine since the age of 12. And again, she was faced with really hard times. And here's the remarkable thing, too, about my grandmother. She started teaching school. She had to walk a long ways on crutches to teach school. And then she eventually became the county superintendent of schools in Sweetwater County, Wyoming, for over 35 years. She was pretty legendary. So I want you to imagine, if you will, you're 26 years old, so not much older than some of you high school students here today. You're 26 years old, and you can never go home again. Not to your city, not to your state, not to your country, not to your home, your house. And every possession you have has been stolen. Every dime you've ever made in your life and your family has ever made has been stolen from you. and everyone you know and love has been killed. How do you find a way to go on and handle that kind of adversity? You're 26 years old. How do you do that? This gentleman right here, Joe Rubinstein, taken when he was 26 years old, was that man. So as I'm talking today and sharing this story, I want you to think about, how do you respond to adversity? What would you do if you were Joe in that situation? I first met Joe Rubinstein not far from here when I was working in a retirement community. This was 2007, and Joe and his wife, Irene, were our first residents that moved in. Joe had a tattoo that ran the length of his forearm. He kept it covered always. But one day I saw a little portion of that tattoo, and I asked him about it, and he said, "It's from Auschwitz." So I said, "Well, Joe, could our daughter interview you for a history class she's taking?" And Joe said, "Never. I will never speak of it." I didn't realize that in almost 70 years, he hadn't told anyone his story. Even his family knew bits and pieces. So I knew it must be terribly hard and very hard for him. So I never asked him about it again. But I just fell in love with Joe. You could not help but fall in love with Joe. He was the most gregarious, kind, outgoing man. He just lit up a room. And Joe and his wife went to Mexico about 3 weeks after I asked him if our daughter could interview him for a history class. And they came back and they brought me this bracelet. And it's carved of it has a dolphin on it. And it is one of my most cherished possessions. And, you know, I shared with Joe before he passed away that I wear this every time I speak about Joe and do a presentation about Joe. I just cherish it. So we became very close. I loved Joe like a grandfather. And again, I knew that it must be very hard, so I didn't bring it up again. So my husband took a job in Topeka, Kansas, so we moved to Kansas. And 5 years later, after I met Joe and asked him if our daughter could interview him for a history class, I was back visiting the retirement community because my parents, and I have my mother here today, and I'll introduce her in a little while, but she was living in the same retirement community and along with my father. And I was driving down the street, and Joe was walking down the street, and he rolled the car window down, and out of the blue, he says, "Nancy, I want to tell you my story." This is 5 years after he told me that he would never share it. And he said, "You like to write." He knew that I had another book that had just come out. And he said, "I want my family to know what I went through, but I don't know how to tell them. Could you write a little something for them?" So I dropped everything, and of course I went right over, and as soon as I heard just a little bit, I said, "Joe, this is a story the world needs to hear." But he said, "Oh, I don't know if anything good could come of this." And we talked more about it, and he finally agreed. But then I'm thinking, I don't think I'm qualified to write this story. You know, I'm not Jewish. I knew shamefully little about the Holocaust. And I think, you know, this is a good life lesson for all of us. Sometimes you have to step out of your comfort zone. I really wanted just to say, let's find somebody else here. And he just kept saying, and I did say that. And he said, "No, I want to tell you my story. I would like for you to write it." So I dropped everything and started working on this story. And I spent the next 2.5 years driving from Topeka, Kansas to Fort Collins almost every month to be able to interview Joe, because he could just handle it in short periods of time, because it was so hard after all this time, if you can imagine. Joe, when he first told me that he wanted to share his story, and I dropped everything, we started talking, and he said, "Nancy, I want to get it all out, A to Z. I've been carrying this in so long, I just need to get it all out." And I was actually sharing this story with a group one time, and I had this up, and they were like, A to Z, Auschwitz, A to Z. How ironic is that? But anyway, when he said he wanted to get it all out, A to Z, and tell me everything, this is the detail that he started telling me his story. First, he shared that he was born in the town of Radom, Poland in 1920. And their family had 5 kids in the family. And when Joe was a very young boy, 5 years old, his father tragically passed away and left his widowed mom to raise 5 kids alone. And they were, again, very poor. And everyone in the family did everything they could to help keep food on the table. Joe would help his mother sell produce on the side of the road. And when he wasn't doing that, he was taking firewood to people to help to try and keep them warm and make a little extra money. And when he wasn't doing that, he was working at a lumber yard, making big, heavy wagon wheels, and he got really strong. And I think that is part of the reason what ended up saving his life later. He got really strong. So it's a good idea to keep strong, because we never know when we're going to need it. And like I said, he would do everything he could to help his family. And the other thing that he did was he started to learn to make shoes. There was a shoemaker in town who was excellent, and Joe started to work and learn from him because Joe was fascinated with shoes. So he learned the trade of making shoes. And so I don't know if you're all familiar with what happened in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Shortly thereafter, they took all the area Jews and they made them move into 2 areas of town, the ghettos. And Joe's family grew up as a very Orthodox Jewish family. So Joe and his family were moved into these 2 areas of the ghetto. And again, that was the early 1940s when they were forced into there. So when Joe said he wanted to get it out, he told me his background, and then he said, it was 4 o'clock in the morning, and somebody was pounding at our door. And I knew that someone pounding at our door at 4 o'clock in the morning could only mean trouble. And I didn't want trouble. We'd had so much trouble since Germany had invaded and moved us into the ghetto. I just wanted to go back to sleep. But I knew, as the oldest male in the house now, that it was up to me to handle what was on the other side of that door. So I walked across the cottage floor. It was bitterly cold. My hand was shaking, and I opened the door, and standing there are 2 German soldiers with machine guns in hand saying, "You come with me." But I haven't done anything wrong. You come with me. But I need to say goodbye to my mom, to my family. You have everything you need. And I looked down at my t-shirt, my shorts, and my bare feet. And I thought, everything I need? And they walked me out into the bitterly cold air. They put me on an open air truck, and they left me there surrounded by strangers, and they left us there all day, all night. And by the next morning, several around me were dead. And then he said, and then they took me to Auschwitz. And that was the detail that Joe started telling me his story. And then he said, they took me to Auschwitz, I worked in a coal mine, and then after the war, I went to Germany. And I thought, I had A and I had Z, but I had nothing in between. And I realized that's partly why I think Joe and how he survived was shoving it away, trying not to think about it. But of course, it was always there. And so I knew at that point, I said, Joe, oh my goodness, all I have to do is write your words down and here's your story. But then a strange thing happened. He got this odd look on his face, and he went from this incredible detail, and he just said, took me to Auschwitz, and I worked in a coal mine. After the war, I went to Germany, and that was it. So again, I spent the next, as I said, 2.5 years going back and forth trying to understand what happened in between. When Joe was at Auschwitz, He was there for over 2.5 years before he was taken to several other camps. And until he shared his story with me, he never told anybody what his job was at Auschwitz. While he was at Auschwitz, he had to move the bodies of the dead. This is before they had the gas chambers. So they had the gas chambers, but before they had the crematoria where they would dispose of the bodies. So they would kill all these people in the gas chamber, and then he had to push their bodies in a little open cart into these open pits where they would put the bodies. And I was sharing this story about Joe at the Dallas Holocaust Museum as a presentation one day, and there was another gentleman in the audience who came up afterwards, and he said it was his great uncle, I believe, that was also his job, was moving the bodies of the dead. And he said the first body that he ended up moving out was that of his son. And until Joe shared his story with me, he never told anyone that while he was at Auschwitz, he had been sexually abused. Never told anyone. And he literally almost died the night before I came back to read him the rough draft because he was so worried about people finding out, especially his family. He thought, if they know, they won't love me. And after he was especially worried about his grandchildren, as you can imagine, even though they were adults. And afterwards, his grandson said to him, "Grandpa, I have never loved you more." And I love that because I think that's such an important lesson for all of us, that we all have things in our past that we keep tight and closed and hidden and we're ashamed of because we think nobody will love us if anyone knew. And Joe was like a different person before he told me than afterwards, and he was free of this thing that he had kept in. And so it's just a great reminder for all of us. If you have something that you've been dealing with that you've never shared with anyone, find somebody that you can confide in, a counselor, a friend, whoever it may be. It's really important. Don't go 70 years and keep something in that you've never shared. Because as I said, Joe was like a different human being. After Joe spent 2.5 years at Auschwitz under just unbelievably brutal conditions, he was sent to several other camps. And I said earlier that Joe had a tattoo. Joe was one of the lucky ones that he actually had a tattoo, if you can believe that. If you've ever heard of Holocaust survivors that have a tattoo, they were at Auschwitz. To my understanding, it was the only camp of many, many camps that actually tattooed people. But the vast majority of people didn't live long enough to get a tattoo. They were dead, often within hours of arriving. And after 2.5 years at Auschwitz, Joe was, as I said, moved to several other camps. He was moved to Ohrdorf, Buchenwald, where he had to move really heavy rocks. And toward the very end of the war, he moved to Theresienstadt. It was a ghetto. It was a ghetto community that they had converted into this camp. And that as Germany was losing the war, they were moving many of the inmates from some of the other camps farther and farther away from where the invading forces were coming, the Soviets, the Allies, and so on. And they kept moving them back farther and farther. And many ended up like Joe did at Theresienstadt. So it was about 2 weeks before the end of the invading force or the liberating force came in. Anyway, Joe and his friend were standing there one day, and they look out and they see the German guards pulling civilian clothes over their uniform. And Joe said, "What's happening?" And his friend said, "It's over. They're going to hide." And there were several days where it was just chaos. As I said, the Soviet forces were advancing on the camp and would liberate it. The Red Cross came in. And eventually, they would quarantine the camp because so many people like Joe were very, very sick. Joe actually had tuberculosis and didn't know it, but he just knew that he was really sick. And after they put the civilian clothes on over their uniforms and left, Joe said they looked up and there's a sign up over the entrance saying, "You're free to go." And Joe and his friends were convinced that it was a trap, that if they walked through that door or that gate, they would be killed. And Joe said, "You know what? I don't care. I am more dead than alive." He was so sick. You know, and when Joe was taken at 4 o'clock in the morning, he had no idea that he would never see anyone in his family again. All of his siblings, his beloved mom, were believed killed at Treblinka, which was just a death camp. So Joe, as I said, was living in Radom, Poland. Before the war, it was anywhere from 70 to 90,000 people. 1/3 of the residents of Radom were Jewish. 1/3. And they were almost all murdered in a 2-day time frame, along with Joe's entire family at Treblinka. Just unimaginable. And while Joe's story is tragic in so many ways, what is also remarkable is all the unique things that happened to save his life. Unusual people would come along, unusual events, and always it was Joe wanting to live, fighting to live, no matter what, determined to stay alive, no matter what happened to him. And after the war, Joe didn't know where to go. He was very sick, as I said. And one day, his buddy said to him, "You know, Joe, I was from Germany before the war." He was a German Jew. And he said, "You need to come back with me to Germany. I still have family there. You need to come back until you know where you're going," because he knew he couldn't go back to Poland. So of all places, Joe went with his friend to Germany after the war, which still is mind-boggling to me in the middle of all this, of what had just happened. But again, he was so sick, he didn't even care where he went. And a strange thing happened when he was there. He started to heal, both physically, emotionally, and spiritually. He just started gaining strength. And he was standing on the street corner one day, and a man came and tapped him on the back and said, "Excuse me, but is that a Polish accent I hear?" And Joe said, "Well, yeah." And the man said, "Well, I'm from Poland originally." He had been living in Germany since the early 1930s. And he talked to Joe a little bit, found out that he had been in the camps, and he invited Joe to come over for dinner that night. And he said, "And by the way, I have a beautiful daughter." Well, Joe and that beautiful daughter were married for 74 years. They spent some of this time right here in Fort Collins. 74 years. And Joe, here he is, a Polish man. He's Jewish. He spent over 5 years of his life imprisoned. And his wife is Polish heritage, but lived throughout Germany during the war. And she was Catholic. And I think when people are trying to figure out how to get along, if Joe and Irene can do it, we all can do it too. Anyone can. 74 years of joy-filled marriage. And then after the war, Joe and Irene got married. She got pregnant, and they decided to come to the United States and wanted to immigrate to the United States. So it spent months, if not years, filling out paperwork and forms and being in camps of displaced persons. And eventually they found themselves on a ship coming to America. And when they arrived, you know what they did? They got down on the ground and they kissed the soil. And they said, "Thank God for America. Thank God for freedom." And so I know that we probably have some people here who were with the armed forces or had loved ones. Do we have any military folks here? Yeah, show of hands, thank you. Because yeah, very much, thank you. Because if you hadn't done what you've done, and the people in World War II and the Allied hadn't done what they were done, Joe would never have known freedom, and many of us wouldn't have either. So thank you so much. And when Joe ended up in New York, you know what he did? He didn't know how he was going to make a living. He barely spoke English, but he was good at making shoes. And so he went into a shoe factory, and he got hired as someone who could make shoes. And as he was getting ready to leave from that interview, he said, well, you know, I don't just like to make shoes, I like to design them. And so the man said, really? And so he handed Joe a pad of paper, and he said, Joe, show me what you got. And Joe sketched out a bunch of shoes, and the man said, Joe, you're now my leading shoe designer. Joe became one of the leading shoe designers in the world. I mean, he designed shoes that were some of the most expensive shoes in the entire world. I've got a couple up here that are just beautiful, and I've got some more sketches that I'm going to show you in just a minute. So it's just amazing what we can do when we keep the perspective of not giving up, not allowing the past trauma that we've been through and the hard times define our future. Joe refused to do that. So I'm going to share a few more slides here. Can everybody see okay? That was Joe and Irene when I first met them in 2007. And you can see why you just can't not fall in love with this couple. They're just so joy-filled. And while Joe passed away in 2022, Irene is still with us, and I am going to be seeing her tomorrow. She turned 100 last year, so and Joe lived to be 101. There's his tattoo. It's a little hard to see, 34207. I had the tremendous honor of sharing Joe's story in his hometown of Radom. Talk about emotional. Oh. And I had this address of this building before I went. I took a picture of it. And when I came back, I showed it to Joe. I didn't say a word. And he said, where that circle, he said, Nancy, that's the apartment where I was born. And that's what the street looks like, well, when I was back there in 2017. This was inside the ghetto in Radom. They used the part of the town to form the ghetto. There were actually two ghettos, and Joe was in one part of them, and some of his brothers were in the other part. And you take a look at the church on the outside there, because when I was back, I was standing in that same spot, and you could still see where the church is. These are the German soldiers that marched into Warsaw. 1939, Joe said it was about a week before they came into Joe's town, and he said they were just everywhere, just overrunning the whole town. The Polish forces didn't have a chance. And I got this slide from a collector for the first edition of the first book. And when I showed this slide to Joe, it's in Radom, he said, Nancy, where did you get the picture of the truck that took me away? Why is it important that we learn stories like Joe's of history? We know that history has a way of repeating itself, and sometimes that way is terrible. And according to The Economist, this was 2023, 20% of Americans aged 18 to 29 consider the Holocaust to be a myth. Joe's story is not a myth. The loss of his family is not a myth. I heard another Holocaust survivor say once, and I shared this with Joe, and he said exactly, when people doubt the Holocaust, he said, then where's my family? Where's my family? It's estimated that approximately 6 million people were murdered in the Holocaust, and that's really hard for us to understand, isn't it? And understand the scope of that. If we were to observe 1 minute of silence, not a moment, but 1 minute of silence for each Holocaust victim, that silence would last over 11 years. 11 years. And several of those were for Joe's family. This one still just boggles my mind. 1/3 of people in major European countries know little or nothing about the Holocaust. This was 2018, and I found that to be true when I went to Radom. The guide who was showing us around was a teacher, and he said, I never heard about the Holocaust. 1/3 of the people in Radom were Jewish. He never had heard of the Holocaust. And he was a teacher. Because after the war, and that part of Poland fell into the communist side, they basically would be punished if they ever brought it up. And so the parents were terrified to ever tell their kids. The kids knew nothing about it. 2/3 of American millennials, people born between 1981 and 1996, surveyed, do not know that Auschwitz was a concentration camp or an extermination camp. This is Auschwitz. I was actually standing on those railroad tracks. You've probably seen this picture before. If I were to, I'm actually standing inside Auschwitz, Birkenau, and if you were to go through there and turn around and look at the railroad tracks, it looks the same, the entrance and the outside. So some of you know that many, many, many hundreds of thousands of people were brought in on these railroad tracks. And they were brought in these railroad cars, crammed in. Joe said it was so tight you couldn't even breathe. They couldn't even stand. Can you imagine? You know, I shared this story at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and I went down and they have an actual car there that you can go in and you stand there and it's clean and it smells just fine. And about half hour later, I found myself on the subway, and it was rush hour, and it was packed, and I got in there, and it was like jam-packed, and I had my arms up, and I couldn't even get my arms down, and I was standing there, and I'm in like this panic, because I couldn't put my arms down, and I started thinking, oh my gosh, and then as I tried to get out, I'm trying to count how many people, and that car that we were in was twice the size of that, and I estimated later there was about 50 people. Joe said there was over 100 crammed into these cars. Couldn't stand. Sometimes the cars would stop for days and leave people. And of course, when they'd open up, many, many would be dead. And this is a picture, an actual picture of people that came into the camp on these tracks. You can see the train car. It looks like I'm standing on it here. And they were divided up, men, women, elderly. Joe said if you were young or old, forget about it. You were dead. They would separate people, and Germany needed able-bodied workers, so they would take some of the people who were young like Joe, and their stated goal was to work them until they died. Can you imagine being worked until you died? And that was the lucky ones, the ones that actually lived long enough to work, although for many it may have been better to perish early. These are the barracks. Auschwitz was huge, 25 square miles. And there was barrack after barrack. So many, many of these people, when they came in on the trains, they thought they were going to live out the war in these barracks. They could see them. As far as your eye could see, they were told, you're going to live in these barracks. So they came in and they had their possessions. And it's haunting to see the actual possessions when you go to some of these museums. But you should. They were told, number your suitcases so that after you get a shower, you'll know, you can come back to your belongings. And of course, their belongings were all stolen and sent out. More than 1.1 men, women, and children perished at Auschwitz-Birkenau. 1 million of them were Jewish. And these are hard to see, the little kids. This is an actual photograph of children as they got off the train being marched to their death. Just beyond words. And this little girl, this is Esther Polak. She was murdered in the gas chambers at Auschwitz, July 28, 1942, 3 months after Joe arrived there. She was 5 years old. I just wonder sometimes, was she one of the bodies? Just heartbreaking beyond words. Children's clothing are on display there. Just, again, so hard to imagine that they walked in with these clothes and the shoes, piles and piles and piles of them. It's just, any of you have had a chance to see these museums, the shoes seem to be especially hard, because you know that they walked into these shoes and they didn't come out, and what's remaining of their lives are these shoes, and the children's shoes. And the possessions, of course, they brought them because they thought they were going to be living out the war, the cups. And for some reason, this one just got to me. They thought they were going to be grating cheese and cooking. It was just so deceiving. This is a picture of Auschwitz, of the one of the gas chambers that has been partially blown up. You can see the snow. As I said, it was over 25 square miles at Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Joe said when it snowed, they had to move all the snow with their hands and scoop it up and put it in their clothes and carry it. They were forced to clear the snow with no tools. More people died in Auschwitz than the combined losses of the British and American people during World War II. If you get a chance to go to any Holocaust museum, I would recommend it. At Auschwitz, they have this book of names, 4.8 million names in this book that takes up a huge amount of space. On the day that Franklin Roosevelt died, April 12, 1945, General George Patton, Omar Bradley, and Dwight D. Eisenhower arrived at the Ohrdorf concentration camp. Joe was actually at Ohrdorf at one time, but he wasn't there. He had already been moved to a different camp. And there they saw over 3,000 naked bodies, emaciated and piled up in the graves. They found a shed piled to the ceiling with bodies. Of that experience, Eisenhower said the following: George Patton, who was a tough guy, wouldn't even enter. He said that he would get sick if he did so. And he said, I did the visit deliberately to be in a position to give firsthand evidence if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, and of course our future president, he was wise. And what did he mean by that? If there ever develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda, because he knew that someday people would say it didn't happen, just like they'll say 9/11 didn't happen pretty soon. We're switching gears to a happier note. This is Joe and Irene after the war, that beautiful girl that he met. As I said, Irene's family was also from Poland, and she had one teenage brother. And during the war, they were living in Germany, and her teenage brother was in a restaurant, and someone overheard him talking, and he said something to the effect of, I don't like what the Germans are doing. I don't like what the Nazis are doing. And that's all it took. They arrested him, took him out, tried him, and killed him. So Irene's only brother was executed by the Nazis. In the 2.5 years and then the many years after that I knew Joe, he used to say, I would give my life for one photo of my family. I don't know about you, but I have so many photos, I don't even know how to store them anymore. Everything is full. My boxes, my refrigerator, my phone, my computer. Joe said he'd give his life for one photo of a family. He said, I can no longer remember my mother's face. And it just haunted him. He loved his mother's face. His mother filled his life with all good things, great food, warmth, and love. It's part of what sustained him when times were really hard. And it broke his heart. He said, my brothers, I can see their faces as if it were yesterday, but I can't remember my mom's face. So before the book was published, I had researchers all over the world looking. I thought, there's got to be a photo of his family. They lived for generations in Radom. And we had looked and looked, and nothing. The book came out in 2015, the first edition. We just released the second edition. And when it came out, Joe said, as I said, he would give anything to see his family. And one of the researchers, 6 months after the book was published, called me and said, Nancy, you won't believe it, but we found some photos. We had been told that these documents had been long since destroyed in a fire, but it turned out they had not. And these were two of Joe's brothers. They came on the ID forms that what they were forced to fill out when they were moved into the ghetto. And you can see the pictures were teeny and little. I have a daughter who is a professional photographer, and she was able to take those photos, and we were able to clean them up, and I was able to give them to Joe, a picture of his mom and two brothers. And I tell you what, I have never in my life seen human emotion like the day that Joe saw the pictures of his family for the first time in decades. We're still missing two photos, one of Joe's younger brother and a younger sister. And Joe asked me literally to the day he died, every time I talked to him, he'd say, have you found them, Nancy? We haven't found them, but I am still hoping that we can find those photos to be able to share with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But I tell you what, he just cherished these photos. Again, his mother on the left, his older brother David on the right, and Joe's identical twin. He was an identical twin. This would have been the first photo that we know that would have looked like Joe. And we know that he would have looked exactly like this because, again, he was his identical twin, other than the only way anyone could tell them apart is Joe had a little mole on top of his ear. Chaim died 80 years before Joe. 80 years. Joe used to tell me that he didn't want to tell his story because he didn't think anything could come of it. And I think that's such an important lesson for us too, because that wasn't the case. We hear from people, since the book was published, from all over the world, all walks of life. And at one point, there was a woman who came up afterwards, and I knew there was something different about her. And she was sobbing and crying so hard. And afterwards, she said, you know, a week ago today, my husband and I were in the front row of the shooting in Las Vegas that killed many people. And she said, I haven't been able to get out of bed. I haven't been able to think that there's any possibility for me to be able to go on living. But she said, after hearing Joe's story, her husband said, we're going to go hear this story. No matter what, we're going to go hear this story. And after she heard the story, she said, you know what? If he can lose everything a human being can lose, and still believe the best in people and find a way to live a joy-filled life, she said, I can too. And we hear variations of that all over from people around the world, and I love that. And the book went on to win some fun awards, and we had a good time with these. We told people they were from the Olympics, but they looked at my body, and I think they knew that that couldn't be the case. And we made an audiobook, and this is Joe with the producer, and they were the narrator, and they made the audiobook of Joe's story. It actually won Audiobook of the Year in Colorado. And we actually have Joe reading the opening chapters, quotes. And then we had a really special day. It was during COVID, but Mayor Troxel, the former mayor of Fort Collins, honored Joe by proclaiming his 100th birthday Joe Rubinstein Day. That was really special. And again, I've been asked to share it, and I share this because Joe didn't think anything good could come of it. I didn't think I could share this story with anybody, anything related to the Holocaust, so it's such a good lesson for all of us. Sometimes you have to step out of your comfort zone and take chances. This is back in Radom on the left side, we were touring with a group of people that were Holocaust survivor families. And at one point, we're on these buses going through town, looking around, and I look over and there's police everywhere. And I said to the guide, wow, something's going on out there. There's police everywhere. And he said, Nancy, it's for us. They're so worried that we're going to be attacked because there's Holocaust victims' family members here. And I just thought, how tragic after all these years that we're still worried about that. We went to the Radom Cemetery. You can see this is not a very good photo. This is the headstones of a Jewish cemetery in Radom before the war, jam-packed with headstones. During the war, the Nazis desecrated that cemetery, and only a few fragments are left, and they've been able to hang a few along the walls. But this was my husband. We were actually trying to see if we might be able to find the headstones of Joe's father who died before the war and a previous sibling that he had that died before the war. To my knowledge, they've never found any of the fragments from Joe's family. The Nazis were using the headstones for pavers, but after the war, slowly pieces have been finding their way back, and they've been, thankfully, a dedicated group of people is memorializing that. Again, I was getting ready to speak at Auschwitz. That was one of the most gut-wrenching things I have ever done. And what was really amazing is that afterwards, several of the people came up and were in tears. And these were guides who hear all these stories, and they were so touched by Joe's story. And I was touched by them. And my good friend Sally back here, Robinson, you can wave, Sally. She came with me on short notice. My husband wasn't able to come when I spoke. And so she helped me get some of these photos as well. That was at night there. And I was standing inside one of the barracks. Joe used to say the cold for him was worse than the starvation. And when you're standing in there and it was January, bitterly cold. And honestly, I think, I do not know how he survived. He doesn't know how he survived. It's just, there's no insulation. These were the bunks. And they say that these were actually some of the better bunks. Auschwitz was built on a swamp, so some of the lower bunks were often filled with water. There was lice, there was bugs. It was just frigid, awful conditions. And when Joe first arrived, they didn't even have toilets like this. Later at Birkenau, these were some of the toilets that they would use. And of course, the people that were housed there had to clean them out. This is actually at I'm losing my brain here. This was at the camp that Joe walked out to freedom. Theresienstadt. Thank you. This is the Theresienstadt ghetto camp. And I'm not positive, but I think that is the entrance and exit that Joe walked out to freedom. And there's one other quick story I want to tell you about Joe walking out to freedom. When they walked out, Joe was very sick. There were 2 other men with him, also inmates, in their striped, not even uniforms. They were just garbs, awful prison inmate garments. Anyway, they walked and they walked and they finally made their way into this little village, and they found their way into a store. And can you imagine? They walk in and the storekeeper's eyes went huge. And they said to him, "We know who you are. Take whatever you want. We owe you more than that." And Joe said he took his filthy striped clothing and dropped them, found something else to put on, and left them there. Joe, this is the ship that brought Joe and Irene. It was a former military ship that they were using to bring displaced people back to the United States. And I got to share one other amazing story. When Joe was in Auschwitz, and he went to work for a while in a coal mine there. After he moved the bodies of the dead, they opened up a nearby coal mine. And Joe said he loved working in the coal mine, because compared to Auschwitz, working in the camp there, this was heavenly to him, even though most people would not consider working in a coal mine heavenly, but Joe did. And he's working in the coal mine, but one day he woke up and his friend said to him, "Joe, you're bright yellow." He was very jaundiced, very sick. So Joe was sent to the hospital, and he was terrified, because if you're sent to the hospital, you don't come out. You're not fit for work. They look for excuses. As I said before, their goal was to work you until you died. So he gets to the hospital, and there's a doctor there. He's treating Joe, and he says, "You know, Joe, if you go back to the coal mine, they're going to kill you because you're not fit for work. They're going to shoot you. And you're too sick to go back anyway. You're going to die if you go back and try to work." So he made arrangements for Joe to work as his assistant in the hospital, treating mostly coal miners. It was a sub-camp just outside of Auschwitz. And Joe was actually able then to stay at the hospital for a few months, working with this doctor. Joe was transferred at some point, never saw the doctor again. 5 years. 5 years after the war, Joe and Irene are on that ship coming to America. He's walking on the deck. Who's coming at him? The doctor. The doctor is now a doctor on the ship. And the doctor said, "Joe, I cannot believe that you are alive." And Joe said, "I'm alive because you saved my life. And by the way, here's my wife, and here's my baby son." And I didn't know the name of that doctor until literally about 6 months ago. A reader in Germany contacted me and said, "I think I know who that doctor was." I had a spelling in the original book, but we didn't think it was quite right, and it wasn't. So we were able to learn a lot more that is now included in the new edition of the book. And I told you I'd share with you a few sketches that Joe did. He had boxes of these sketches of shoes that he designed, and they're beautiful. You just mentioned the word shoes to Joe, and he lit up. He could tell you everything there was to know about shoes. And actually, as I said before, I've got a couple here. These shoes here reportedly were in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And they're beautiful, and they have bows on them. And Joe's specialty was bows and ornaments. And I said to him today, "So Joe, I know you designed bows, but is there any other part of the shoe that you designed?" And he looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, "Well, the whole shoe." So... And there was Joe. He was known as Smiling Joe all his life. And Joe, one of the things that they did, Joe and Irene, is they used to dance whenever they got the chance. He said, "We tried to dance away our sorrow." And that's another important thing to remember. When times are hard and you're trying to learn how to go on, find things that you love. Joe loved designing shoes, and he loved to help other people design shoes so that they could make a good living for themselves. He wanted to help each other and dance and find hobbies. And this is Joe on his last birthday. He was 101. And look at his still joy. He's got a glass of wine and a cupcake. I love that picture. And there Joe and Irene are toasting to a wonderful life. So I asked you before, how do you respond to adversity? When you're faced with hard times, I want you to think about Joe. Oops. This is a picture of my grandmother holding me. And you know, when my grandmother was 9 years old and lost her leg, I know she never envisioned a moment when she would be holding her grandchild. And yet that was the result, because she never gave up and she never gave in to despair. She kept fighting for the life that she wanted to create. And she did create it. And here she's able to hold a grandchild. And you know, I love this picture, but it could be any one of us in this room, any one of you in this room, because you know what? Somebody has loved you like that, and somebody in your past has fought for you in the worst of times. Our ancestors, every single one of us here, every single one of our ancestors went through really tough times, and they didn't give in to despair when times got tough. They kept fighting for their life, and because of it, you're here. We're all here. And we need to be grateful for those people and remember to play it forward in the future so that we can be like them for future generations and impact people. Not only did she end up having lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but she influenced many lives through being a teacher and a superintendent. Again, that was far from her mind when she was struggling to overcome. And yet that's the result. The same is true for Joe. When Joe faced hardship on a scale that none of us can imagine, I'm certain he never, ever envisioned a moment when on his 100th birthday, he would be cradling his great-grandchild. And yet that was a result of Joe fighting to stay strong. I want you to hear Joe for yourself.
Yeah, your story teaches good lessons to anybody who is able to read it.
That's why I'm blessed to stay here
Yeah.
and enjoying people, meeting people, still helping people if I can, even today. I'm still active. I exercise every day, and I don't want to give up my life because I love life, I love people.
I didn't want to give up my life because I love life and I love people, and that was Joe. And that is his message for all of us, to love one another, to be kind, to be grateful. Oops. Joe asked me to tell everyone. He said, Nancy, tell everyone they must love life, they must love God, they must love each other, because that's all there is. And what a message that is for all of us. This was Joe's motto of life. Life is precious. And life is so precious. Every one of your lives is so precious. And so I just encourage you, when times are hard, to think of Joe, to think of my grandmother, who overcame so much. Love your life. And so that someday, generations from now, people will say about you, you did your very best when times are hard. You didn't give in to despair. You kept fighting for the life you wanted. That's what Joe wants for all of you. And that's what I know my grandmother wants for all of you as well. So keep fighting for your life. Your life is precious. We don't know how much time we have. We could have a week, months, hours, years, decades. But however much time we have, do your best when times are hard, because it will impact your lives in ways that you can't imagine. And it will impact people's lives for generations. Thank you. Thank you.